This episode of Wasteland may contain mature themes, profanity, and descriptions of sex, graphic violence, and criminal activity. Listener discretion is advised. I've never liked the woods. Not that my lifelong residency in Central Florida affords me much opportunity to get outside and experience natural beauty. Not when it's absolutely sweltering for 10 months out of the year. Just stepping outside can sometimes feel like walking into a gigantic mosquito net, drenched with steaming drops of humidity. So no, I've never been much of a hiker or a camper. Even weather permitting, I find the woods to be an unwelcoming place. Like so many other things here, Florida's forests are different. There's no rolling hills, no majestic redwoods, no craggy outcroppings over freshwater springs. Our foliage twists itself up from shallow, sandy dirt, the terrain's unending flatness broken only by the occasional swamp or sinkhole. Scaly, yellow-eyed things skitter through the underbrush. Spiders the size of your hand spin webs between the palm trees. Bloated mosquitoes circle lazily, looking for an exposed bit of skin. Sometimes the buzzing of the cicadas seems like it will never end, the shrill noise rising to a fever pitch that blocks out rational thought and only makes the brutal temperature feel that much hotter. So for me, a forest is a bad place. And it's not only because of the discomforts of a harsh climate and bothersome fauna. No, forests, especially in Florida, are a good place to hide things. Things that you don't want found. The squirming, crawling denizens of the Sunshine State's ecosystem, whether covered in exoskeleton or armor-like scales, will make short work of whatever gets left behind. The soupy, primeval swamp waters, undulating like a repugnant milkshake. They can keep a secret safe. But this unforgiving ecological community has been here a lot longer than we have. It ebbs and flows, unconcerned with our wants and needs. Trees fall, animals die, swamp waters recede. Things wash up. And sometimes, something that should have stayed a secret is revealed. Tomoka State Park lies at the north end of the part of Central Florida I call home. It sits on 900 acres of peninsula, one of the last unspoiled pieces of nature in the area. It's a popular destination for vacationers, offering modern amenities, camping, hiking, fishing and boating on the Tomoka River. There's also a road nicknamed the Loop that does just that, loops through the entire area. It isn't a part of the park proper, but it provides access. By day, it's a beautiful drive. By night, it's altogether different. The absence of streetlights and the trees meeting in a canopy over the road produces a tunnel of the pitch-black variety. In my younger years, driving through the Loop in the middle of the night was a rite of passage. We would pile in the car and tell each other stories about the ghost of a Native American that would run beside the car, keeping pace. If he didn't get us, it would be the dreaded mugwumps, some half-man, half-alligator hybrid one of us had dreamed up. At some point, the driver would click off the headlights, plunging us into a careening death ride of almost total darkness, lit only by the dim illumination from the dashboard. I would look out at the miles of trees rushing by and think, anything could be out there. You'd never know. Someone could put you out there, and they'd never find you. But then again, they just might. And which would be worse? Monday, December 6th, 2007, 7 a.m. A fisherman casts his line from the Tomoka River Bridge, trying to enjoy the brief Florida winter for as long as he can. Maybe it's even cold enough for him to blow into his hands, to sip from a thermos of coffee. Down here, the dog days usually stay away from December, resulting in a month or two of reprieve from the incessant heat. For a few brief moments, Central Florida becomes livable. From the bridge in Tomoka State Park, the fisherman can see the sun twinkling off the river, the palms and ferns swaying in the chill breeze. Perhaps he thinks this is a perfect morning. Until he sees the garbage bags on the shore. I don't know the name of the fisherman who found those bags, but I'm sure of one thing. He won't ever forget this morning. Inside one of the black plastic bags were 2 legs and a torso. Another contained an arm and a foot. The body parts were identified as belonging to Michael Scott Lewis, 27 years of age, Dirty Mike to his friends. And I know that because, in a way, I knew Mike. Now, I wasn't friends with Mike Lewis, but we both attended Atlantic High School back in the late 90s. He was a few grades ahead of me, but Mike was a bit of a standout, so his presence didn't go unnoticed. Mike was part of the social clique unfortunately referred to as the Freaks. He and his friends wore black clothing, listened to heavy metal and punk rock, and behaved in a generally rebellious way. Atlantic High was built a bit like an outdoor mall, so instead of milling around the hallways and meeting up at lockers, students had a courtyard in which to socialize. On my first day of 9th grade, I sat down on a concrete planter right across from where Mike and some of his friends were skulking about. One by one, kids who were more my own speed began to join me. Soon, our little area was buzzing with a group who would see me through the next 4 years, and in a few rare cases, right up to this present day. I could see that Mike and his friends, whose leader seemed to be a big guy named Ralph, weren't thrilled at this throng of newbies who had just sprung up on their doorstep. But in the months to come, a shared interest in the same type of music, skateboarding, and BMXing would bring our two groups together. They, the seasoned rebels, us, the young naive startups, just trying to find our identities in the hellish social experience of high school. Though I found myself spending time with some of his friends, I never hung out with Mike. And within a year or two, he was graduated and gone. I wouldn't hear about him again until they found what was left of him on the shores of the Tomoka River. That was 13 years ago. And in the interim, I just couldn't help myself. I just wanted to know the answer to the question, who killed Mike Lewis? Saturday, January 5th, 2008. An employee at a Chevron station in DeKalb County, Georgia, phones police. He's watching a strange-looking man cleaning out a white Chevy Astro van in the parking lot. The guy you are looking for is cleaning out his van, says the clerk to the police dispatcher. I like to imagine a newspaper bearing Gary Hilton's face laid on the counter in front of the clerk. He would be looking out into the parking lot and back at the paper, back to the parking lot, then the paper. Yes. This was indeed the man wanted in the disappearance of 24-year-old Meredith Emerson, who vanished on New Year's Day during a hike on Blood Mountain. When the police arrive, they find Meredith's ID and some of her blood-stained clothes in the convenience store dumpster. They also find the man who killed her. At just a little over a month past his 62nd birthday, Gary Hilton didn't look his age. He was a lean man, in good physical shape due to his decades spent outdoors, hiking and fishing. At the time of his arrest, he had no home and was simply living out of his Astrovan with his dog, Dandy. Hilton called the national parks home. He would spend his nights camped on out-of-the-way trails where park rangers wouldn't think to look, where, no matter what Hilton did, he wouldn't be disturbed.
The reason for killing the girl, it was either once you've taken someone, you're either going to kill them or you're going to get caught. It's as simple as that.
Gary Hilton was born on November 26, 1946, in Atlanta, Georgia. Though he took the surname of his father, William Estes Hilton, according to his mother Cleo, Gary never knew the man. In fact, it appears that Cleo didn't know William all that well either. After Gary's birth and a hasty marriage, Cleo discovered her new husband had 2 other families, neither one knowing about the other or her and Gary. She was granted an annulment soon after. Gary's youth was marked by constant travel. Cleo was a sales executive for a Venetian blind company, and Gary accompanied her on all her business trips and relocations. When Gary was 8, they moved from Atlanta to Tampa, Florida. It was here that Gary sustained a telling injury, one that many serial murderers can lay claim to. The small family apartment contained a Murphy bed, the kind that folds up into the wall. At some point, the bed fell from its slot, the metal framework coming down on Gary's head, taking the back of his scalp off, according to Cleo. The injury required 200 stitches. When all was said and done, Gary appeared to be fine, though according to some experts, this trauma would have far-reaching implications. In 1958, Cleo and Gary moved across the state to Hialeah, a city on the east coast of Florida just northwest of Miami. It was here that Cleo met an Argentinian horse breeder by the name of Nilo de Bag, the man she would marry. And though Gary helped Nilo with the horses, animals which he raced at the famous Hialeah Park racetrack, Nilo didn't seem to have a lot of love for Gary. Nilo was, by all accounts, a hard-working immigrant, though extremely temperamental and verbally abusive. In Argentina, children Gary's age already had jobs to provide for their families. He thought Gary's schooling was a waste of time. On top of this, Nilo resented any attention Cleo gave her son over him. Despite his volatile stepfather, Gary, by then known as an intelligent, imaginative young boy, even if he was a bit rambunctious in school, bore the man's tirades, never reacting. That is, until he did.
Gary was saying that he had an incident with Nilo.
He what?
He had an incident with Nilo. It was a bad incident when he was about 14.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
I'd rather not discuss this in front of.
Okay.
Yeah.
In 1959, when he was 13 years old, Gary Hilton shot his stepfather right before he enrolled in junior high school. The attack was not fatal, however, and Nilo, surprisingly, chose not to press charges on Gary. Perhaps he realized he had, in some way, goaded Gary into the act. Perhaps he simply feared what his stepson would do next unless he let the incident drop. Whatever Nilo's reasoning, Gary was not to escape punishment altogether. He was sent to the psychiatric wing of a hospital in Miami. Aside from this, understandably, Gary's shooting of Nilo created a rift between himself and Cleo, exacerbating an aloofness in his mother that had always been there, just under the surface. She only allowed him back into her house right before he began school at Miami Springs Junior High. After the incident with Nilo, Gary seemed to develop a taste for lawbreaking. Along with his friend Dino Sclafani, he became adept at stealing from local fruit stands. He even once managed to make off with an outboard boat motor. Gary also began to show a keen sense for living and surviving in the outdoors, no easy task in the harsh South Florida climate. This would be a set of skills he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Like most other teenagers in the early 1960s, Gary loved rock and roll. Not content with just listening to music on the radio, Gary sought to be an active participant. He taught himself to play the drums by banging on old cigar boxes and eventually joined a local band called the Majestics. But this blissful life of teenage rebellion wasn't to last very long. Cleo's coldness toward her son began to take its toll on Gary. He was sent to live with family friends for a time, and eventually, Gary dropped out of high school at age 17. He joined the Army in 1964. Gary trained as a paratrooper and was deployed to West Germany where he earned his GED. He even married a German girl by the name of Ursula, and over the course of the 4 years he was enlisted, Gary Hilton was given an assignment of some distinction. They were called the Davy Crockett Platoon, named after the weapon they were tasked with handling. The Davy Crockett, itself named after the frontier legend, was the smallest and lightest nuclear weapon ever deployed by the United States. The missiles were fired from a recoilless rifle with a maximum range of 1.24 miles. Gary's platoon was instructed to guard the line of demarcation separating Western-occupied Germany from Soviet-occupied Germany. If the Russians ever crossed into the Western Zone, the Davy Crockett would be fired, killing the enemy, but also Gary's entire outfit, due either to the initial blast or the lethal radiation left behind. In short, the Davy Crockett platoon was on a suicide mission. And this did not sit well with Gary Hilton. Sometime in 1967, Gary began to hear voices, which eventually resulted in a nervous breakdown. At 21 years old, he was honorably discharged from the army. He returned to Hialeah with Ursula. But the marriage was not to last. Soon after moving to Florida, the couple began having problems. According to Cleo, Gary was working 2 jobs while at the same time trying to earn his associate's degree. Having no time to devote to his new bride, Ursula soon found herself estranged from Gary and cheated on him with another man. By this time, Cleo had moved to Argentina with Nilo, and she encouraged Gary and Ursula to follow suit. Perhaps a new start would repair the young couple's relationship. In the end, Gary and Ursula divorced, and Gary remained in Hialeah. In 1970, Gary qualified for his Florida chauffeur's license, though he lost it due to a DUI in 1973. He returned to DeKalb County, Georgia, and was briefly married and divorced a second time. Gary then went to work as a phone solicitor, which turned out to be about as legitimate as it sounds. Working in what used to be known as boiler rooms, Gary would con people out of their hard-earned money, convincing them that they were donating it to a charity. Though he was a quiet child, now as an adult, Gary had the gift of gab. He spoke in quick torrents, often jumping from topic to topic without stopping to catch his breath, a skill that served him well in this illicit environment. Still a consummate outdoorsman, Gary met his third wife in 1977, a park ranger named Dina Bow. Gary's way with words went a long way to masking the person he was slowly becoming, but it didn't take long for Dina to realize she had married a budding criminal. Not only did Dina discover Gary's phone solicitor job was nothing more than a scam operation, but she came to realize that her new husband was molesting her daughter. So, just like his first 2 marriages, Gary's third ended in divorce in 1978. The next 20 years of Gary Hilton's life amount to one long rap sheet. As he descended further and further into a criminal lifestyle, he was arrested at different times for phone solicitation, theft, arson, and firearm and drug possession. A 3-time divorcee, Hilton was now alone with his dogs, first Ranger and then Dandy. Gary loved dogs and enjoyed spending time outdoors with them. They weren't as complicated as humans. They lived by an instinctual code. Gary seemed to respect dogs for their loyalty, their simple habits, as well as for their ferocity when pushed into a corner.
Because when dogs talk to each other, they quite often revert back to the wolf world. And the wolf world is more incredibly savage and brutal than you can ever imagine. Wolves are one of the only animal that I know of, other than human beings, that will run down and run down and run down and run down and go and go and go after another member of their own species to kill it.
Perhaps the most bizarre turn in this story happened in 1994 while Gary was living the small-time con lifestyle and drifting around Georgia. If what comes next sounds like something out of a movie, that's because it is. Though it isn't clear just how the meeting occurred, probably owing a lot to Gary's way with words, Gary Hilton made the acquaintance of a man named Sam Rail. Rail was a Georgia defense attorney who was dipping his toes into the direct-to-video movie business. Rail had even formed his own production company, the Suwannee River Picture Company. When Gary found out Rail was in the movie business, he told him his idea for a film. Let some beautiful women out in the woods, and then they can be hunted down like prey, Gary said. Though his one-sentence pitch of a man hunting humans bore a strong resemblance to the 1932 classic, The Most Dangerous Game, which itself served as the inspiration for a litany of films like Predator and Battle Royale, Rail's interest was piqued. Later, Rail would confess that Gary had a certain charisma that just drew you in. And Rail saw success in Hilton's idea, a sexy, scary exploitation B-movie thrill ride. With the home video market starting to explode in 1994, they were sure to make a bundle. Deadly Run was released direct-to-video in 1995. The movie starred a cast of no-name actors and was directed by two equally unknown directors. The writing credit is attributed only to Joe Gillis, an oft-used pseudonym named after the fictional narrator of the classic Sunset Boulevard. The story revolves around a wealthy Atlanta realtor who leads a secret life unbeknownst to his wife and children, kidnapping females and hunting them in the North Georgia wilderness.
How much does our past determine our future?
Some people can shape their own destiny. Others have no control over their fate.
How long can we hold back our deepest secrets?
We may have a bona fide serial killer on our hands. There's a definite pattern to at least 22 of these cases.
Meeting me can be dangerous to your health.
I think Nancy's been abducted and she's most probably dead. I think the guy that did it to her has done it before to a whole lot of other women. If we're gonna catch this guy, we're gonna have to do it ourselves.
This guy picks up his victims in bars.
Kills them, buries them more than 200 miles away. He's got a plane, so back in his hometown, nothing's happening. Everybody's fine.
This pen. That guy that night in the bar, he gave me this pen.
Highland Realty Company, 913 Park Lane.
We have a witness who can identify the man last seen with the girl.
Bobby Wilson has something to do with all this? You'll be fighting an uphill battle. Bobby Wilson's one of the most influential men in this entire county.
Your husband is lying to everyone.
I think you did break into Barbara's house last night. I also think you're responsible for the disappearance and the probable murder of Nancy Delaware. I also think that you're gonna screw up, and when you do, I'm gonna be there.
You're gonna kill me. Go ahead and do it.
You know, it's just no fun when a girl can't put up a little fight. I mean, I'm a hunter, Barbara. Where's the challenge?
Danny Fendley.
Don't be moving around too much now.
Amy Bush.
You're the only one for me.
David Jacob Ryder.
The plane was found in the same vicinity as a body discovered in a shallow grave several years ago.
Deadly Run.
Gary served the production in a collaborative capacity. He provided the original inspiration for the plot as well as location scouting. He even found the cabin where Deadly Run's antagonist would bring his prey before setting them loose in the wilderness to kill. But it was what would be found 13 years later, just 30 miles south of that cabin, that would prove Gary Hilton's cinematic fantasies had been all too real. By 1997, Gary had secured a job as a telemarketer for Insulated Wall Systems, a Georgia business owned and operated by a man named John Tabor. He would work there on and off for almost 10 years, and though Tabor provided Gary with a job as well as an occasional place to stay on his property and several monetary loans, Gary's mind soon turned to darker things. Tabor described Gary's increasingly erratic behavior as squirrely. Gary began demanding money from Tabor, eventually going so far as to threaten his life. Sometime in 2007, Gary Hilton left Insulated Wall Systems and Tabor's property altogether. He hit the road in a white Chevy Astro van along with his dog Dandy. And though no one can say exactly when or why, Gary began to form a plan. Saturday, December 1st, 2007. Cheryl Dunlap, age 46, is last seen alive at 1:30 p.m. in the Leon Sinks area of the Apalachicola National Forest, just 15 minutes south of Tallahassee, Florida. Cheryl had gone to the sinks to enjoy the long-awaited cool air of December and to read a book. Two hikers, Michael and Vicky Shirley, are the last to see Cheryl. Cheryl misses dinner with a friend that night and church the next morning. On Monday, the same day her missing persons report is filed, her Toyota Camry is found in the forest, the tires punctured. 3 ATM withdrawals are made from Cheryl's bank account, totaling $700 on Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. When police look at the ATM's camera footage, they see a man wearing a mask made of surgical tape. He looks almost identical to actor Claude Rains' portrayal of the Invisible Man in the 1933 film. On Monday, December 15th, Cheryl Dunlap is found. A hunter uncovers her body in Apalachicola Forest. Her head and both of her hands are missing. Tuesday, January 1st, 2008. A hiker passes 24-year-old Meredith Emerson on her way up Blood Mountain in Georgia's Chattahoochee National Forest. The young UGA student, accompanied by her dog Ella, is no stranger to trail hiking. The hiker nods a greeting as the two pass each other. A bit further down the trail, the same hiker passes Gary Hilton and Dandy, though he wouldn't know this until later. The hiker notices a police baton hanging from Gary's belt. That night, the hiker who passed Meredith and Gary on the Blood Mountain Trail stops at a local convenience store. He mentions the man he saw carrying the police baton. A little later, another hiker enters the store carrying the baton and several other items, including a fanny pack. He leaves them with the clerk, telling him he found the items on the trail. By the time the hiker passed Gary and Meredith, Gary had already introduced himself to her in the parking lot. Both of their dogs made each other's acquaintance and seemed to hit it off. They began the hike up Blood Mountain together, though it didn't take long for Gary to lag behind. He told Meredith to go ahead of him. Once he felt they were alone, Gary caught up to Meredith and, brandishing a bayonet he had hidden in his jacket, demanded she give him her ATM cards and PIN numbers. But Meredith wasn't your typical damsel in distress. The young college student was in great shape from years of hiking and self-defense classes. Understanding immediately what was happening to her, Meredith began to fight back, punching and kicking Gary, even when he managed to break her nose. She kicked the bayonet from his hand and yelled continually, trying her best to alert anyone who might be within earshot. It should have gone a different way that day in the dark shadow of Blood Mountain, but in the end, Gary managed to overpower the struggling Meredith. He marched her up the trail, where he zip-tied her to a tree and gagged her with a nylon cord. Luckily for Gary, Ella was an unusually docile animal. Her barking wasn't enough to draw attention. After making sure Meredith was secure, Gary realized he had left his baton and bayonet back on the trail. Meredith had been wearing a fanny pack and it had fallen amid the scuffle as well. He had to retrieve the items lest he leave evidence of the abduction. But when he reached the site of his fight with Meredith, the items were gone. Meredith Emerson spent the first 4 days of 2008 and the last 4 of her life in the company of Gary Hilton, Dandy, and Ella. Gary kept her restrained inside his van via a collar connected to a chain. They drove aimlessly around southern Georgia and northern Florida, stopping every so often for Gary to attempt to withdraw money from Meredith's bank account. She knew, and rightfully so, if she provided Gary with the correct PIN number for her card, he wouldn't need her anymore and would kill her. So, she kept him moving, hoping someone would find her. Each failed transaction was like a footprint, a record of their movements throughout the Southeast. It wasn't until January 2nd that Meredith's boyfriend reported her missing, but despite Meredith's best efforts to keep Gary occupied, her whereabouts remained unknown to her loved ones. The day after she was reported missing, Gary and Meredith actually returned to Blood Mountain. They made camp on one side of the summit while the other side crawled with volunteer searchers, police, and dogs, all looking for Meredith. Earlier that day, Gary had phoned his old boss, John Tabor, desperate for money. He was unaware that, thanks to the hiker he had passed on the Blood Mountain Trail, his description had already hit the news, and Tabor, in turn, had a pretty good idea of who the police should be looking for. Tabor attempted to lure Gary out into the open by offering him his old job back. Tabor then alerted the Georgia Bureau of Investigation of his suspicions. Now the police not only had a description, they also had a name. It wouldn't be long before Gary Hilton was in custody. As it turned out, it was just long enough for Meredith Emerson to lose her life. Gary Hilton bludgeoned her to death with a jackhandle on Friday, January 4th, 2008. Once she was dead, he decapitated her, discarding her head and some of her clothes on one of the trails. Gary was arrested trying to dispose of the rest of Meredith's clothes the next day.
By the way, you can tell John Tabor that I'm the one that killed the girl, okay? I'm the one that killed her, but the reason she's dead, I want you to tell Tabor this. The reason she's dead, now I killed her, okay? But the reason she's dead is that when I called him on Wednesday, I guess, or Thursday, yeah, Thursday, or whenever. Thursday. When I called him, that girl was alive. She was in my van. Yeah. She's in the parking lot at the whole house.
On January 9th, just 4 days after Gary was arrested, Cheryl Dunlap's head and hands were found in a campsite fire pit, 7 miles away from where her dismembered body was discovered in Apalachicola Forest. It would be 2 years before Gary Hilton was dealt his punishment for the murder of Meredith Emerson, and during that time, police departments from Florida and North Carolina were comparing notes on unsolved homicides. Gary's MO wasn't something that could go unnoticed for long. He killed in national parks, usually by bludgeoning, and then dismembered his victims to delay identification. On February 15, 2010, Gary Hilton was convicted for the murder of Meredith Emerson. After striking a plea bargain to convince Gary to lead authorities to the rest of Meredith's remains, the state of Georgia issued him a life sentence. The state of Florida was not so kind. Since 1976, Florida has executed 93 inmates, among them some of the most recognizable names in serial murder: Ted Bundy, Danny Rawling, and Eileen Wuornos. To the Sunshine State, Gary Hilton was just another rabid dog that needed to be put down. There would be no plea bargains, no deals. A year to the day from his conviction in Georgia, Gary Hilton received a death sentence from the Sunshine State for the murder of Cheryl Dunlap. Not to be outdone, the federal government brought yet another indictment against Gary on June 21, 2011, only 2 months later.
Authorities in western North Carolina say they have now linked Gary Michael Hilton to the slaying of an elderly North Carolina woman and the disappearance of her husband. The body of 84-year-old Irene Bryant was discovered on November 9th in the North Carolina woods, and her husband, 80-year-old John, is still missing. Hilton was recently charged with killing 24-year-old Meredith Emerson, whose body was found more than a week ago in a Georgia state forest. But authorities will not say how they connected the two cases.
Due to the complexity of the Bryant investigation and the continuing investigations in other states, details regarding the timing or venue of criminal charges will not be released at this time.
Like Emerson, Bryant died of a blow to the head, and her body was found near a hiking trail. A neighbor of the couple says he's not surprised by the new development.
My first instinct was yes, because there were some similarities with they were both in hiking and woods, and then as more details came out, then we started suspecting that there could be a possible link.
Hilton has also been named a suspect in the death of this woman, Cheryl Hodges Dunlap, whose decapitated body was found a month ago in a national forest in the Florida Panhandle. Investigators in North Carolina are also looking into whether Hilton could be linked to the disappearance of yet another North Carolina hiker, a 26-year-old woman, last seen December 7th. Brian Thomas, The Associated Press.
Of course, that news story appeared before Gary had been convicted of his crimes. John Bryant was indeed missing. However, his body was found on February 2nd, 2008. the day after Gary was indicted for Meredith's murder in the state of Georgia. The North Carolina couple had been missing since October 21, 2007, about a month before Cheryl Dunlap was abducted. It would be 2012 before Gary confessed to the slaying of John and Irene Bryant. As he was wont to do, Gary accosted the couple on a trail in Nantahala National Forest in North Carolina. There, he bludgeoned Irene to death and kidnapped John, holding him captive to obtain his ATM PIN code. On October 22, 2007, Hilton withdrew $300 from the Bryant's account. With his life belonging to Georgia and his death to Florida, a federal grand jury in North Carolina grabbed their own piece of Gary Hilton in the form of a second life sentence. If the victims' families were awaiting some sort of an explanation as to why Gary Hilton murdered their loved ones, an educated guess was put forth during the penalty phase of Gary's trial for the murder of Cheryl Dunlap. Dr. Joseph S. Wu, assistant professor in residence at the Department of Psychiatry at the University of California, offered that the injury Gary sustained from the Murphy bed when he was 9 was a significantly contributing factor. Wu claimed that Gary's frontal lobe had likely been damaged. Without the accident that caused this, his life trajectory would be entirely different, said Dr. Wu. The frontal lobe is known as the center of the brain that controls our social behavior. Though it is not a guarantee, any damage to this area has the potential to result in poor impulse control. The frontal lobe is believed to have evolved as a kind of off switch or muzzle, capable of suppressing our more primitive impulses. Gary Hilton is not the only serial killer known to have sustained a head injury. The list reads like a rogues gallery of the worst criminals of all time. At the age of 7, Albert Fish, known as the Brooklyn Vampire, and one of the most despicable monsters of the early 20th century, would fall from a cherry tree, resulting in severe head trauma. Fish would go on to dabble in nearly every form of deviant behavior, including, but not limited to, murder, cannibalism, child molestation, and self-torture. As a child, John Wayne Gacy, who raped and killed 33 young men in Chicago in the 1970s, was hit in the head by a swing, which caused a blood clot on his brain that would go undiagnosed until the age of 16. Richard Ramirez, known as the Night Stalker and brutal murderer of 13 people in Los Angeles and San Francisco in the early 1980s, sustained not one, but 2 head injuries as a child. Infamous killers Richard the Iceman Kuklinski, Fred West, Troy Victorino, Bobby Joe Long, and Henry Lee Lucas are all purported to have suffered significant brain injuries, possibly resulting in a mindset that is more likely to commit murder. On the subject of Gary Hilton, Dr. Wu posited that his injury was exacerbated by Gary's abuse of drugs and alcohol, as well as his antisocial lifestyle. Wu added that a prescription for Ritalin that Gary had been abusing may have caused him to be hyper-aggressive, a state of mind which might explain the ferocity of his killings and the dismemberments. It also might explain why Gary began killing around the age of 61, an uncommon trait in serial killers. The Florida DA attempted to minimize Gary's head injury by pointing out that the Murphy bed did not come down on the front of his skull, but on the back. How then could this damage Gary's frontal lobe? Dr. Wu pointed out that the point of impact doesn't always determine the location of the damage. A blow to any part of the head has the potential to cause brain damage. As of this recording, Gary Hilton is still awaiting death at Union CI, a prison in Rayford, Florida, just under an hour's drive west from Jacksonville. UCI counts aforementioned serial killer Bobby Joe Long and mass murderer Troy Victorino among its distinguished guests. In February of 2019, his final state appeal, alleging ineffective counsel during his 2011 trial for the murder of Cheryl Dunlap, was rejected. Hilton's only recourse is now to appeal to the federal level. Hilton's current attorney has stated that they will drop all appeals if the state will commute Hilton's death sentence to life imprisonment. The state of Florida has rejected this proposal. Gary Hilton's life is a complex tale, to be sure. But do you remember how I began this episode? I asked a question. Who killed Mike Lewis? Mike Lewis, a former schoolmate of mine, who was found dismembered on the shores of the Tomoka River 5 days after Cheryl Dunlap disappeared, and nearly a month before Meredith Emerson was taken from Blood Mountain. Could his death be the work of Gary Hilton? Gary drifted in and out of state parks and national forests, seemingly at random. If Mike was killed after Gary encountered John and Irene Bryant, and before Cheryl Dunlap went missing in Tallahassee, the time frame would be feasible. Tomoka State Park is only a 6-hour drive from the Carolinas and a 4-hour drive from Tallahassee, and perhaps most damningly, there is the dismemberment, a signature for Gary Hilton. So did he do it? What was left of 55-year-old Jeffrey Albertsman was found on July 26, 2017. Police entered his home on North Street in Daytona Beach after Albertsman's mother requested a welfare check as she hadn't heard from her son in a while. The unmistakable smell of decay greeted the officers. Albertsman was long dead, having suffered a bullet wound in the head, though this wasn't the first thing the officers noticed. His arms and legs were missing. They were found 20 miles away in a fernery in DeLeon Springs. And after finding blood evidence in Albertsman's home, they were able to identify a likely culprit, his ex-girlfriend, 67-year-old Nelsie Tetley. Albertsman and Tetley's relationship doesn't seem to have ever been a healthy one. In April of 2013, Albertsman drove himself to the hospital after Tetley maced him and stabbed him with a kitchen knife. At the time, Albertsman had been living in a hotel, attempting to leave his abusive partner. But Nelsie Tetley doesn't seem to be a woman so easily pushed aside. Albertsman told police that his ex began to follow him and call him constantly. In fact, it was an attempt at ending this harassment that brought Jeffrey to Nelsie's door where she attacked and stabbed him. Even so, Tetley received a light sentence, 2 years community service and probation. She was jailed after a violation and released shortly thereafter in 2013. In October 2016, Albertsman filed an injunction against Tetley after she once again attacked and threatened to kill him. Tetley was hit with another 11 months probation. But Tetley couldn't wait. 8 months later, she is alleged to have shot Albertsman and brutally dismembered his body. On February 8, 2018, Tetley pleaded not guilty to Jeffrey Albertsman's slaying. But the prevailing opinion is that Tetley is guilty. Because this isn't the first time one of Tetley's ex-boyfriends has been found, chopped to pieces. 10 years ago, Mike Lewis suffered that same fate. There's a bar here in Daytona Beach called Tiernanog. It's a dive, vaguely Irish-themed. Its claim to fame is the Wednesday night open mic comedy shows. Believe it or not, I used to dabble in stand-up, and I performed at most of the Nog's open mics for a couple of years in the early 2010s. And who do you think could be heard from the back of the room, cackling the loudest at all the comedians' jokes? Well, Nelsie Tetley, of course. Nelsie never missed a comedy night. She was a fixture, an unobtrusive part of the landscape, that is, until you got her laughing. She was so nondescript that I never really noticed her, not until someone pointed her out to me one night and said, "That's the woman Mike Lewis was dating," right before he died. I'd always heard the rumor Mike had been dating an older woman. Somehow, some way, he jilted her and wound up dead. I'd just never given it much credence until that night. Noticing her, really seeing her for the first time, it didn't seem like such a stretch. I don't know if Nelsie Tetley killed Mike Lewis. What I do know is that she is alleged to have shot Jeffrey Albertsman in the head before hacking him to pieces. Generally speaking, a repeat killer will use the same methodology. What worked once will probably work again. And they never found Mike Lewis's head. At the beginning of this story, I said that forests are a good place to hide things. A forest knows no judgment, though it has no allegiance either. It's up to nature whether it will hold on to your secret or not. With the arrest of Nelsie Tetley, the death of Mike Lewis appears to be a secret that the darkness is finally ready to let go of, and I'll be watching closely as the story continues to unfold. What is perhaps most concerning, despite the tragic deaths of Michael Scott Lewis, Cheryl Dunlap, Meredith Emerson, John and Irene Bryant, and Jeffrey Albertson, if Nelsie Tetley is guilty, if Gary Hilton didn't kill Mike Lewis, then in December of 2008, there was not one, but two monsters stalking the woods of the state of Florida. Disappear here. This phrase occurs throughout author Bret Easton Ellis's 1985 debut novel, Less Than Zero. The story follows the nihilistic exploits of Clay, a young, rich, disaffected college student who goes home to LA for winter break. Ellis's prose is minimalistic, dreamlike, and at certain points, incredibly jarring. Clay's world is one devoid of emotion, and he drifts indifferently through it, each scene a callous, drug-fueled, and increasingly savage vignette. Disappear here becomes Less Than Zero's motif. The first time Clay sees the phrase on a billboard, it provokes a reaction in his usually apathetic demeanor. Ellis writes, "I come to a red light, tempted to go through it, then stop once I see a billboard sign that I don't remember seeing, and I look up at it. All it says is disappear here, and even though it's probably an ad for some resort, it still freaks me out a little, and I step on the gas really hard and the car screeches as I leave the light." I've always taken the phrase to be a bit of a warning to Clay, something to cut through the fog of his dispassion. Clay spends most of the novel drinking, doing drugs, and having anonymous sex. But there is something worth saving in Clay, something hinted at in a flashback he has to a childhood vacation when his grandfather was dying of cancer, and he seemed to be the only member of his family at all concerned about it. But the city of Los Angeles, it seems, has the power to dampen that empathy, to make him disappear. Perhaps that is what Clay wants after all, to disappear from his monotonous reality. There are places, powerful places, where those who are of a mind can disappear, where they can leave everything behind, become someone, something else entirely. Florida's doors are always open. We wait at the end of the road, the last stop on the line, for the good and the bad, the lost and the found alike. Waving the promise of a brand new life like a spectator waving a sign at a marathon runner, the sun, the water, It will rejuvenate you. It will fill the gaps, make you whole. You will once again be bright and shining. But it's not always true. The darkness here is deeper than most places. Without the roots of a history, of a foundation aside from seasonal debauchery and transient use, nothing takes hold here but the most shallow and indifferent of weeds. Use once and destroy. That's our culture, our motto. It's in our DNA. We provide the fun, who you are when you arrive and what you leave behind when you go. That's our mess to clean up. Our secret to keep. And that's what Florida is. Despite its fluorescent, twinkling exterior, a secret place, a hidden place. From afar, you can't see beneath its surface, probe its depths, understand its strange and terrible nature. It's a wasteland where nothing of substance grows. Still, the allure calls them here. The tourists, the snowbirds, the prostitutes, the dealers, the retirees, the newlyweds, the killers, and the monsters. They come to do one thing: disappear. This episode of Wasteland was researched, written, produced, recorded, edited, and in some areas, scored by me, Michael Paul Anthony. If you'd like to contact the show, the email address is wastelandpodfl@gmail.com. I want to thank you for listening, and if you like what you heard, please share it with a friend. Until next time.